All right, Isaiah, thank you for that. And we are welcoming in today's roundtable for a continued discussion on rail, specifically around safety and some service. So joining me today, we've got Harris Ligon from Telegraph and Tony Hatch from AVH Consulting. Guys, thank you both so much for joining us this morning. Great to have some really good perspective here on our roundtable.
Thanks for having us.
So let's go ahead and start off with the service aspect of things. Of course, everybody knows that we're talking about CPKC, and Harris was on with us earlier this week. We talked a little bit about some expansion, some service expectations there from that merger. And Harris, let's start off with you, just kind of reiterating the CPKC merger and now the opportunities that are abounding, not only on those established lanes, but on some outside lanes as well. How are we seeing service start to uptick after the merger?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the overall volume numbers, kind of across the three different countries that span North America. Mexico is really having a time. And we've seen kind of an increase in volume. Year to date, they're up roughly 4%. I think week over week coming into the holiday, they were up, more than 20%. So they are having a time down there. And you have to acknowledge the fact that you now have new services that are crossing the border, which are likely facilitating quite a bit of that. From a service standpoint, I think all eyes are on making sure that when you're adding new dots to a map, you're not doing so in a poor manner that are disencouraging or disincentivizing shippers to actually join in on that. So we see service standards from across border actually at their year-to-date averages. So nothing new to report there on a service standpoint.
Tony, from your perspective as well, obviously we've seen CPKC, I can never get that acronym right, start to expand some of their territory with the intention to use some of those established lanes that are out across the southeastern United States, specifically through Mississippi and Alabama. Can you talk a little bit about what you see with this? And we mentioned it earlier this week, how it's almost kind of useful and really encouraging to see that this merger has not necessarily focused just on those CPKC established lines, but also now in expanding out in other service areas.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say earlier in the week to you was that it's really going to hopefully help change the narrative. The railroads have had, three big body blows in the last 2 years. Right? They've had service issues. They've had a messy labor negotiation that was misinterpreted as some kind of walkout that wasn't. But they've had a safety issue around East Palestine, despite the fact that they are much safer than their competing modes. What they've been trying to move the narrative to unsuccessfully is one of growth, a pivot to growth, to quote the CEO of the new CPKC. And yeah, that is awkward. And one of the great things about their recent investor conferences, it was all focused on new opportunities that this, huge connection of east-west up through Canada, transcontinental, and then a big north-south lane that goes all the way down through Texas and then in Mexico City and beyond. That really creates huge opportunity. Mexico is doing well. Really, historically, they've been the fastest-growing market in North America because of what we now are calling nearshoring, but what's been going on for a while. And of late, of course, the auto cycle has been helping them a lot. I don't think that CPKC has contributed a great amount yet, but they certainly expect to. They see a world of a potential $5 billion revenue hit looking at the 2030 hit's the wrong word, gain. So the very fact that they are attempting things like the new CSX Meridian, Mississippi offer and whatnot is really terrific for the industry. It injects a level of competitive haste on the one hand, and on the other, it's really talking about growing. And as opposed to cutting heads and other things that rails have done in the past, perhaps necessarily, but really, they're talking about, once again, getting growth energy, and these guys will be a leader of that. And that's going to be ultimately good for the entire industry if even some of the others are going to feel the competitive pressures at first.
I think that narrative rewriting point is really, really important to kind of hone in on, because it seems like, especially if you're looking outside of niche transportation media and into the mainstream media, there was a lot of very negative sentiment towards the rail line, specifically through about the middle parts of last year, through, of course, the East Palestine issues. And as you and Harris both can say, rail is one of those safest modes of transportation, and that's not necessarily highlighted everywhere, right? Of course, we know the old news saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So if we're looking looking at that and continuing to see this narrative rewrite, CPKC is playing the offensive a little bit, right? They're getting in front of that growth narrative. They're getting in front and saying, hey, we are establishing these lines. We're looking to include established competition and really increase that competition while maintaining the safety of our system, but also the health and safety and well treatment of our employees. Harris, have you seen that really come to fruition following the labor talks and in really the 6 months since that, where CPKC has taken a stand forward to not only increase safety, but also help manage their employees a little bit better following those labor negotiations?
Look, as Tony mentioned, right, the CPKC, and I think what is becoming more evident as we look at, not only the partnership and acquisition with Kansas City Southern, and we think about their investment with a lot of physical facilities with Americold Logistics, they're bringing on 1,000 containers onto their rail lines to really kind of amp up their ability to launch and provide fresh food and cold chain services across their rail lines. It's very clear to me they're playing a different game. And I think as we saw, one of the pieces around that will be to encourage better competition across the nation. Your point around specifically labor agreements and how they treat their employees, I think it's too early to say that there anything substantial that CPKC is doing with respect to those items. But I think what we've seen across the industry is that most of the labor agreements have been settled. Most of them have been very favorable in many ways for both parties. I think Union Pacific actually just announced that they've ratified a new work schedule with their scheduled conductors and engineers, excuse me. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that there is a widespread acknowledgement that if you do want to grow, you have to invest. And in many cases, as we've seen, contrary to years prior, that investment has to be in your people. And so I think that's one of the items when you're operating a service network and when you move physical things in the world, that is done no better by actual highly trained, highly competitively paid, and well-skilled employees.
There's also this very big time shift, it feels like, where the labor force of today isn't just necessarily going to lay down and take the treatment that they've gotten in these last decades, really, of laboring. So I think that that's a really good point to hone in on as well. Tony, let's pivot a little bit to you talking about second quarter earnings. Of course, we can expect to see some of these companies report coming up pretty soon, and we're looking at pretty flat to downturned earnings again in the trucking space. But what about in the rail side of things?
I will answer that. I mean, basically, I think I gave you my answer. We talked before that they're not, I said, meh. They're not, nobody's really going to focus on these earnings right now. They're going to be adequate given the volumes. We know what the volumes are every week. So nobody's expecting great things. What we want to hear is out of the narrative. I really want to point out one thing that's related to both what we expect to hear and what we've been talking about, that the change narrative, CPKC is going to be the leader because, their merger is really, it's 80% growth focused. It's, the benefits they see are coming out of volume gains. But the narrative was already beginning to change. And frankly, I think one of the leaders in doing that actually was Norfolk Southern, the beleaguered company whose train derailed in East Palestine, although they have been found so far to be, not negligent and they spend adequate capital, et cetera. But I think in December at their investor conference, they really began to talk about investing in their employees. CSX does the same thing. I think the narrative has changed. CP and CN are, as heretofore mostly Canadian carriers, weren't really part of the labor negotiations that took all the headlines last fall. So it's the U.S. carriers who are larger, who need to respond to the growth initiatives of CPKC and need to focus on changing employee relations, stakeholder relations in general, and their own version of pivoting to growth, investing in the long term. So I think the problem with that is that narrative is a kind of a trust me. It's a slow evolution, whereas CPKC is a brand new baby, right? They can get out and say, here's what we got, come take a look, come by. I believe the entire industry, or almost all of the industry anyway, are really understanding this change starting at the very end of last year and beginning to implement it. And that's really what I hope to hear more of out of the second quarter earnings. The numbers are not going to be terrible because railroads are pretty well managed from a financial point of view, but there's certainly going to be no great shakes. There won't be a lot of evidence of that growth in the quarter, so there's still an element of faith, but hopefully they'll be talking the right talk. And pretty soon, maybe led by CPKC, we'll start to see the walking as well.
I love it. Guys, thank you both so much for joining us for this roundtable. Great to have you as always. Take care, have a good weekend, and we'll chat with you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right now we're going to go ahead and take one final break. We'll be back to wrap up your Friday show in just a few minutes.